Thank you for listening to Gooston's Bible Time. Today's sponsor is Anchor. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. It's free. There's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Thank you all for coming tonight. The topic that we are going to be looking at is Nietzsche and the New Atheists. The four people that are the moniker of the New Atheists, I suppose, continuing in the Apologetics, but looking particularly at how to counter the New Atheists and the New Atheist movement. But yeah, Josh is going to be leading us as always, like an epic gamer. So Josh is going to pray for us. He's going to get into the meat and potatoes of it, so you can do that whenever, Josh.
Help us understand how they think, that we might tear down all argumentation that would set itself up against the knowledge of Christ, and thereby show them Christ, set him forth as who he is, his person and work before them as his salvation necessary for them. Give us wisdom and knowledge to be able to bring your gospel to those who do not believe it yet. And by your power, you will save, by your grace, your mercy, those who hear your gospel and turn and believe it. So we put our hope for all evangelism and apologetics in you and the power of your truth. Help us to remember that and to not trust in our own wisdom. Amen. All right. Well, the last many weeks, we have been going through this apologetics course, and if you're not caught up, then I recommend going back and listening to the previous ones whenever the titles start on the apologetics route. Start listening there, catch yourself up. I'm not going to review everything because as the weeks go by, the amount of content to review at the beginning is becoming excessive. So I will review briefly. For the last few weeks, we've been talking about atheism and its different expressions in the world. We started with Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche. After going over evolutionary naturalism first and responding to that as a worldview, we looked at Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche, who are the presuppositional counterparts within atheism. They assume their atheism at the outset and then provide critiques of religious belief, but within an atheistic framework and in an atheistic universe. Assuming that that is the world we live in, they then critique religion from that basis. So we looked at them, and then in the subsequent weeks, we've been looking at their progeny, those who have picked up their thought, developed it, advanced it. We looked at the Hegelian outlook, the Marxist outlook, and the way that it has developed within our cultures today. And last week we looked at Freud's children, the sexual revolution, and all of that entails. And this week we will look at Nietzsche's children. And when I say that, it's a bit misleading. I don't think any of these people would tie themselves necessarily to Nietzsche, but the reason I'm tying them to Nietzsche is that they are as presuppositionally committed from the outset to Nietzsche's statement that God is dead and we have killed him. And so they go as far as they can to attempt to bury any remnant of God that might remain in the minds of people or within the culture of our world. And that brings us really, there are many people. We could have talked about Bertrand Russell, we could have talked about some other folks, but I wanted to talk about the New Atheists because they had an immense impact on my generation. Some of you are Zoomers, and or even whatever comes after that, I guess, and are not familiar with the New Atheists, or probably aren't. You might be. But when I was in high school, many, many years ago, the New Atheists were on tour around the world, selling books, New York Times bestsellers left and right, and were holding rallies and conferences, and they were the next big thing. Now, the remnants of them settled into r/atheism, and they just sit there and huddle around the campfire and sing songs to each other. And that's about the extent of it. However, the arguments that the New Atheists put forth were popularized and spread like wildfire to the point that you will hear those from atheists, even if they are not self-aware enough to know where it's coming from, that it came from Dawkins or Hitchens or Harris or Dennett. They're using their arguments. The only one of these guys that I know of who's still fairly well known is Sam Harris. You may be, if you're familiar with any of them, it might be him, because he has, in a twist of irony, joined some of the free speech freedom fighters out there. Because though he is an atheist, he doesn't like his atheism being squelched in any way by the government, which I don't blame him on that end whatsoever. So that's the reason that we're going to look at them, and their connection to Nietzsche is simply this: when Nietzsche said God is dead and we have killed him, in the book in which he said this, it's a fictional story. He's a parable, if you will, that he's presenting, and the man is in the marketplace crying out that God is dead and we have killed him, and no one is listening to him. And he goes away hanging his head, saying, "They're not ready to hear this yet." I'm paraphrasing. The quotation is a little bit lengthier, I believe. He said they're not ready to hear this. And he was right. The people in his time period, by and large, didn't listen to him, didn't pay attention to Nietzsche and to his nihilistic approach to life, that because God is dead, there is nothing, and because there is nothing, do what you will, assert your power and strength in the world, and take what you want, live your life to the fullest that you would like to, do what you please, because there is no God above us to judge us or to hold us accountable to how we have lived our lives. He stared into the void stared back, and he said, "All right, great, let's dive in." Well, the New Atheists stared into the void, and the void stared back, and they said, "You know what, we're going to pretend that's not there." As their connection to Nietzsche is that they all are always on the precipice of becoming him. They just won't go far enough. And that's actually the trick to confronting them, is to, well, make them more like Nietzsche, or at least get them to admit that that's the natural conclusion of their argumentation. So that's the connection there, is that they are presuppositionally committed at the outset to a godless universe. And they go from there and try to puzzle the rest out. But who are these folks? Who are they? Well, they were called, jokingly, obviously, the four horsemen of the non-apocalypse. Because, they're atheists. So they don't think that's going to happen in any way, shape, or form. No matter your eschatology, if you're an atheist, your eschatology is the universe will die in a horrible heat death at some point, something like that. And everything in it will die. So that's the way they were described. Now, this is the early 2000s, or rather mid to late 2000s. When I was in high school, a friend of mine knew I was religious, though I wasn't a Christian at this point, but he knew that I believed in God and had some moral principles that I attempted to ground in my religious upbringing. There were things that I wouldn't say or do, and people pretty much knew that about me. And he walked up to me, he handed me a book, and he said, "Hey, if you read this, I'll read the Bible." I was like, "Okay, cool. Sounds like a fair trade." And the book he handed me was a copy of The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins. I didn't read it. I didn't read books back then. Well, I didn't read nonfiction books back then, unless it was for school. And I eventually just gave it back to him. It sat in my book bag for weeks, and I hid it from my. Obviously, I never took it out at home because my parents would have been freaked out if they had seen it. And that was my first encounter with the new atheism, and it remained fairly popular into the early 2010, 2011 era, and it's kind of died out, mainly with the death of its most popular proponent, Christopher Hitchens. Christopher Hitchens was a British journalist who became an American immigrant, eventually American citizen, who wrote on many subjects, and one of those was against religion. He mainly saw the threat of Islam as being the most pertinent one, but he also wrote against Christianity avidly and debated and did all kinds of things of that nature. And he was the most popular one out of all of these simply because he was British. So, British people, for whatever reason, get popular with Americans because they have the fancy accent and they sound 10 times smarter than us just by having the accent. There you have it. So, if you're in here and you have an exotic accent, it makes you sound smarter to a lot of Americans, and they're more likely to listen to you. So, have fun with that. So, he was probably the most popular one out of the Four Horsemen. And he passed away from cancer. I believe it's 2011. And that led to the decline of the new atheism. Its arguments, again, are still very much in use. Richard Dawkins, a evolutionary biologist, his PhD, his dissertation, is on the selective pecking in the domestic chick. For some reason, he thought that qualified him to write a book, a fairly lengthy book, at least his first book on the subject. It is 400 pages, a little over, a little under, depending on the fluff at the beginning and end. About 400-page book on whether God exists or not. I don't know why he thought that was a good idea. His book proceeded to be torn to absolute shreds by many Christian philosophers and theologians alike. But that book, as I said, became very popular. It was a very popular level book. It was sold, for some reason, again, in the philosophy section of popular bookstores, like Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, etc., and made it to the New York Times bestseller list. Again, for what reason, I do not know. Having read most of it in the past, it is difficult to read, not because the content is challenging, but because he's very whiny about a lot of it. So, evolutionary biologist and a journalist team up with Sam Harris, a neuroscientist, who again thinks that qualifies him to write a book on philosophical ethics and morals. His main book, The Moral Landscape, which was his dissertation, oddly enough, attempted to ground ethics in neuroscience. Good luck. Spoiler, he failed. Daniel Dennett, the only actual philosopher on our list of Four Horsemen, again attempted to ground ethics in evolutionary theory, and again failed. Even the philosophical community was not a fan of his work in that regard, and is not a fan of his other work on in certain other areas. So those are our four horsemen of the new atheism and their arguments. There were others who kind of tagged along on their coattails, Dan Barker being probably the most well-known and the most active still, I think, at least in terms of the atheism project. Sam Harris has moved on to other things, at least for most of his popular, as far as I'm aware, anyway. Maybe he's still going on about this, but he's moved on to other things and has found unlikely alliances, I think, with some folks who are more deeply religious than he is, at least openly, acknowledging their religious commitments. So those are our four villains of our story, I suppose. And again, what made them popular was the pseudo-intellectualism that they wrote and spoke on a popular level that was easy to ingest and to digest and to regurgitate. And many 15-year-old edgy fedora tipping kids did exactly that back in the mid to late 2000s or 2010 range. And some of those fedora tipping teenagers are now grown men and women, I suppose. They maybe not the fedora for them, I don't know. And those are the people that we have a responsibility to bring the gospel to. And so that's why we're going to talk about some of their basic beliefs and respond to some of it. I'm not going to belabor the point too much because a lot of their arguments I've responded to elsewhere and in the past weeks that we've been going over this. But let's look at a few of the basic beliefs, some quotations from some of their works, and do a little bit of a response, and then we will wrap up. So their first basic belief is that all of them are, generally speaking, anti-theistic. What that means is they're not just atheistic, but they're anti-theistic. They want to convert you to atheism. They want to actively seek to get people to give up their theistic beliefs, whether it be Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, doesn't matter to these guys. They think that religion is bad for society. Christopher Hitchens, one of his books, is called God is Not Great, subtitle, How Religion Poisons Everything. Seems like a cheery fellow, doesn't he? And that is one of the basic commitments, which is why speaking with someone who is committed to this perspective is very difficult, because you're actually trying to convert each other. That's always a much more interesting situation than you talking to someone who doesn't care what you believe that much, but you care deeply about what they believe and about them coming around to the truth. These guys are they want you to come around to their perspective just as much. And you'll notice that a hallmark of the new atheism, that it shares a lot of, very religious beliefs with religions. So they're anti-theistic and evangelistic, though they have no evangel, they have no gospel, but they certainly are attempting to make converts. Secondly, they're presuppositionally evolutionary naturalist. They do not argue for their evolutionary naturalism, but they assume it as a starting point. One of their main talking points is that the burden of proof for God's existence lays itself upon the shoulders of the believer in God. And the atheist has no obligation to provide any support, evidence, or argumentation for his position. To get there, they do a bit of fancy wordplay, shenanigans, sophistry, as it is called, by saying that their position is a negation, it's a negative position. It is atheism. It is not theism. The burden of proof is on the person making the positive assertion that God does exist. The atheist is completely justified in his atheism by virtue of the absence of evidence for God. That the starting point of theism is not intuitive, nor is it an appropriate starting point because it makes a positive assertion about the world. Now, that's just a bit of fancy wordplay. A negative position can be turned into a positive position simply by restating it. In the same way, a positive position can be turned into a negative position by restating it. So I can turn the positive position, God exists, into a negative by saying that it is not the case that we live in a world without a God. Or, sorry, there I go. See, it's fancy wordplay, and if you mess it up, it makes you look dumb. It is the case that we live in a world. Sorry. See, it's a lot harder to do it in reverse. Okay, give me a second. This is what I give for not writing this down. We live in a society, yes. That's all you have to do. It is the case that we do not live in a godless world. There you go. So I've changed the positive position into a negation. No, I did it right the first time. It is not the case that we live in a godless world. I did it right the first time. I don't know what I'm doing. Here we go. Who asked me to do this? Justin, fire me. Or edit this part out at least. No, you don't have to do that. That's too much work. So I can turn a positive position into a negative. God exists. I can restate it such that I say it is not the case that God doesn't exist. Double negative becomes a positive. That's all atheism is doing. It's just when they do that, it's just wordplay. It's not an argument. The burden of proof lies upon each person per their worldview. Their worldview has to be able to give an account for reality, which means every asserted worldview has a burden of proof. So if I assert that we live in a godless universe, that is a positive claim that requires me to give an account for all the things in it and how they work and function and justify themselves and support and have support and things of that nature. And if I say we live in a universe created by God, same thing. I have the burden to give an account for my beliefs. Okay. Wordplay isn't my forte, as we have seen. I have a degree in sophistry and I didn't learn a thing about it. Okay. So they are presuppositionally committed to evolutionary naturalism, and each of them try to give an account for ethics within an atheistic framework. So they actually do try to shoulder the burden of giving an account for morality because they recognize that one of the chief arguments against atheism is the moral argument. The one that is most compelling to many people's, at least to their intuitions, is that you cannot give an account for objective morals in a godless world. So, each of them, notably, try to do this in different ways, but they do try. So that's another staple of their system. So when you bring the moral argument to bear, or rather try to get them to go all the way with Nietzsche, where Nietzsche said, morality? Heck it. Throw it out the window. Who needs it? I sure don't. I'm going to just assert my strength, will to power, do what I want. No big deal. That's scary to them because many of them also, again, free speech advocates. Hitchens was against, he did a lot of writing back in the day against the Soviet Union. Harris, again, even today, trying to advocate for freedom of speech, things of that nature. So they try to establish a foundation for their ethical systems, but they fail in every case because you cannot build ethical systems in a godless universe. We've already discussed that in the past. Lastly, their arguments primarily are appeals to emotions, appeals to intuitions, and appeals to the reality of evil. Their arguments primarily consist of appeals to emotions, appeals to intuition, and appeals to the reality of evil. What do I mean? Well, they argue against religious belief primarily on the basis of you shouldn't feel this way about the world or about yourself or about a god of any kind. It's a bad way to feel about things. You shouldn't feel fearful of God. You certainly you don't understand emotions like love. Love, as described in the Bible, is actually evil. To love that way. Bertrand Russell was famous for kind of going all the way and being consistent and claiming that Jesus actually doesn't have good moral teachings. And these guys all read Russell and picked up on his argument there. Or appeals to intuition. So it goes something like this. Just think about this with me for a second. Doesn't it just not make any sense for insert Orthodox Christian belief to be true? It doesn't seem like any reasonable person would really believe this, right? That's an appeal to intuition. They're appealing really to your emotions, to your gut feeling that you have, and trying to influence that gut feeling in a particular direction. And finally, appeals to the reality of evil. They'll say, Dan Barker is infamous for this, and we'll read some from him, but Dawkins as well. It's, hey, evil things have been done in the name of religion. Religious people do very evil things. Religion doesn't make you a better person because religious people do evil things. Therefore, religion is bad. It is an asinine argument, and we should point and laugh when people make it. At least laugh at their argument. Don't laugh at the people. They're being deceived and jerked around by the credentials of these types of authors. But again, nevertheless, the argument is silly. There's no bearing on the truth or falsity of the matter, but yet they use them. So let me give you some quotations with some of that argumentation in it. Here is all three of them in one. This very infamous quotation from Richard Dawkins in The God Delusion at the beginning of chapter 2. He says this: "The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction." So notice at the beginning, I'm no longer quoting here, notice at the beginning that he's already made an appeal to how you feel about it unpleasant. It's not that he's false. It's not that he's wrong. It's just unpleasant. And then he is presuppositionally assuming the falsehood, the non-existent of the God, by saying the most unpleasant character in all fiction. So already he's not made an argument. He's assumed his position, and he's now going to describe how he doesn't find this God very pleasant. According to Richard Dawkins and his moral intuitions, this God is not very pleasant, and you should agree with his moral intuitions. Here's his list. Most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving, control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. That's his description of the God of the Old Testament. I don't know which Old Testament he's reading, but Yeah, there it is. Now, that quote there contains no actual argument against Christianity. It is one man's opinion about the morality, or rather, his perception of the ethical nature of the actions of God in the Old Testament. Now, the simple question for Mr. Dawkins here, because I'm not going to acknowledge his PhD at this point, because he's not making any use of it in this argument, because the selective pecking in the domestic chick has no bearing on whether God exists whatsoever. He could be completely right about that in his, observations there, but it doesn't help him here. He's stepped into a different arena where, as far as credentials are concerned, I have more than he does. But let's not let the tyranny of the expert control our perspectives. Let's examine it logically. His opinion, which is all this is, because he has not demonstrated this, he's provided no quotations from the Old Testament, no actual demonstration of what he's saying. Rather, he is just asserting in a string of big words, as was pointed out, that he just finds God in the Old Testament very unpleasant character. But that doesn't disprove God's existence whatsoever. Here's the funniest part. He could be right. Let's just, for the sake of argument, grant him that he is right about his evaluation of the character of God, just for the sake of argument. That has no bearing on whether God exists. This evil God could very well exist. In fact, there were people in the past who believed that the world was created by an evil God. They saw the God of the Old Testament as an evil God, but they still believed he existed. They were called Marcionites. They were heretics. And some of them still run amok today. But that alone, easy to demonstrate, that this doesn't disprove God's existence. This is just Dawkins' perspective on the ethics of what God did in the Old Testament. Now, the trick for Dawkins is there's a simple question for him. By what standard? By what moral standard are you evaluating the actions of God in the Old Testament? Do you have one? What does it mean to be vindictive? What does it mean to be racist? Why are these things bad? Dawkins can't give an account for any of that. So on his worldview, his critique of Christianity just falls apart. It's, okay, you think it's bad? Well, give me a reason to believe you that it's bad. Now, if he actually makes the argument, the more sophisticated version of the argument he's attempting to make, but because he's laughably bad at philosophy, he's just not able to make it, is that the actions of God in the Old Testament are inconsistent with the commands that he gives to his people. Now, that's a different argument, and that's one that's doing an internal critique of the Christian worldview. And we can respond to that argument in a number of ways. But that argument has to get down to particulars. It can't be general. If someone makes that argument, you have to ask them to give you examples. Because making a general claim like that doesn't work. You can't just say, well, you know what? I think God in the Old Testament is contradictory. Why? Because he gave commands to his people that he then violates himself. Okay, show me. Show me where. 9 times out of 10, they're not familiar enough with the Bible to be able to show you. Or if they have some vague ideas, they heard it secondhand, third hand, and cite places. You ask book, chapter, verse, where is it? They don't know. You go look it up together. Turns out they misunderstood the context. They misunderstood what was happening in the narrative. That happens a lot, a whole lot, whenever discussing the Bible with atheists in particular. So here we have a great example of appeals to evil, appeal to intuition, appeal to emotion, all wrapped up in an opening to this chapter, and that is the nature of the argumentation throughout the book. It's like I said, it's pretty hard to read. We have another one from Dan Barker, because I couldn't find my book from Christopher Hitchens, so we have to settle for a discount Christopher Hitchens and Dan Barker. Sorry. Hitchens is much more enjoyable to read because he was at least an actual writer. So there's that. So this is mid-chapter. Barker says, the claim that I am an atheist because I don't understand love is particularly ironic. Now, for context, he's giving a bunch of bad arguments that he's heard that people give him for why he is an atheist. It's really weird. But one of them is you are an atheist because you don't know the true meaning of love. Now, I don't know who said this to him, what Christian said this to him. I don't doubt that a Christian said this to him because Christians say lots of really dumb things to atheists all the time. So there's that. But he's responding to that argument here. He says, I do understand what love is, and that is one of the reasons I can never again be a Christian. Love is not self-denial. Love is not blood and suffering. Love is not murdering your son to appease your own vanity. And he's talking about the Father pouring out his wrath on the Son for the sake of his own glory. Again, wordplay is very heavy within their argumentation. They just switch words around, say things that actually the sentence means something different, but they're just twisting it slightly. Love is not hatred or wrath, consigning billions of people to eternal torture because they have offended your fragile ego or disobeyed your rules. Love is not obedience, conformity, or submission. It is a counterfeit love that is contingent upon authority, punishment, or reward. True love is respect and admiration, compassion and kindness, freely given by a healthy, unafraid human being. Now, that's not an argument. This is just his opinion on what love is. But notice, he doesn't argue for his reasoning at any point. He just asserts, assertion. Love is like this. Why? Because Dan Barker says so. Why would I take my cues on what love is from Dan Barker? Why? What made him an expert on love? His credentials is that he grew up as a traveling charismatic preacher and then apostatized and became an atheist, and it made him a lot of money. Yes, the age-old question asked by the great philosopher, the great philosopher, Rick Astley. What is love? What is it indeed? That's the question that we can ask to Dan Barker. And unfortunately, he will not give us the response that we want. Baby, don't hurt me. Instead, he tells us that litany of garbage. And the saddest part about it is that he preached as a pastor for a traveling evangelist or something like that, for many years, and clearly did not even understand the gospel by his understanding of what love is in Christianity. And then his understanding of love now, again, it has no basis. On evolutionary naturalism, what is your basis for grounding the reality of love or a definition of love? That it works, it helps the evolutionary process, it helps society function. It's all utility oriented, which means that you don't understand love because love often goes against the evolutionary process. It causes people to make decisions and take actions that are not useful to get the evolutionary process moving. So he actually can't ground love in his worldview. Even the kind of love that he describes cannot be grounded in his worldview. So him just asserting repeatedly that he does understand love doesn't refute the argument of the person who made it. You're an atheist because you don't know the true meaning of love. Actually, that's true. In a sense. Now, the person who says this has to expound upon it more than just saying it the way they did. But it's absolutely correct. The atheist does not understand love because no unbeliever does. They don't. Jesus explains the definition and meaning of love, and he expresses it with his actions by laying down his life for needy, rebel sinners who have rebelled against God, defaced his image, spit in his face, and denied him and defied him. And he dies for his enemies and demonstrates his love. That we were yet sinners, he died for us. So, no, Dan Barker doesn't understand love because no non-Christian does understand love properly. But there you go. That's Dan Barker for you. So we'll wrap the New Atheists up a bit here. Remember, with our apologetic methodology, we have a two-pronged response. We have an internal critique, which we have been demonstrating somewhat here, and our external critique, where we set forth the truth of the Christian worldview. The New Atheists attempt to, but fail at every point, to give an account for morality, science, reason, and logic within a godless universe. They all fall to the Nietzschean sword, the nihilist sword. Why should I give two flying flamingos about what they have to say if they're right? If they're right, I can believe whatever I want. It doesn't matter. See, the thing about the New Atheists is they were anti-theists. They thought that religious belief was bad for society and that people should drop it. But if they're correct about us living in a godless universe, who cares? It's all going to hell in a handbasket. Why should we care about what anyone believes? Why should you care about what I believe? I don't know. And they don't either. At least on their worldview. So from the Christian perspective, we can explain and give an account for reason, logic, math, science, all ethics, all of those things, as we talked about weeks ago. We can give an account for those things. God created, God spoke, God is, God sustains, and God interprets the world in such a way that we can know it, we can trust him, and we can be saved from the fall that we made, sin that we brought into the world by trusting in Christ, turning from our sin, the one true God who took on human flesh, lived and died for us. The gospel answers and provides an account and a meaning, a history, a narrative that flows consistently and easily throughout all of the facts that we do know about the world. So we can present the Christian worldview, as a capital T truth, to the New Atheist and give an account for all the things that they sputter and flutter and flip and flap their arms about trying to explain and can't. And so we can explain love to Dan Barker, and we can explain morality to Richard Dawkins, and he can't, neither of them can answer us back in any way, shape, or form, at least that is consistent with their evolutionary naturalism. So there we go. That's it for that. Next week, we'll be looking at functional atheism and several of the ethical worldviews that I have given reference to tonight, but did not go into. We'll look at those. And then the week after that, we'll have a special guest on to do some interactive apologetics with. He's an old friend. Some of you know him. So, yes, indeed, it shall be Andrew. So yeah, I'll pray, and then we can open the floor for questions. There might not be that many because I've covered a lot of this stuff territory before, but if you got them, I'd be happy to answer. All right. Lord, thank you for this time together to examine the folly of unbelief. Help us to kill the unbelief in our own hearts, that these kinds of arguments tempt the strongest of believers to doubt you, to doubt your word, to doubt the world you made. So before we go and set our swords against the towers of atheism out in the world, let us turn them upon ourselves first. Kill the sin in us by your word and your spirit. For the sake of your Son and his glory, I pray. Amen.
Amen. Well, like Josh said, can now open the floor for questions. So if you have any questions, you can put them in the Bible study chat, or you can use your microphone to ask them, but now is the time to do that.
I will hold on to that question. I'll circle back around and we'll look at it after I see if there's any that are relevant to the immediate topic. So if they're not, I'll answer it. But the first one that was typed. But I will answer it. But let's see if anyone has anything that's about what we were just talking about. That's because we're not done. You don't get it on hostage yet.
I think it's probably safe to answer the swearing question.
Yeah, I think so. All right. What is it that makes swear words bad? I think it was answered a while back, but I forget. Well, it depends on who you asked, but yeah, so there's no list of words in the Bible that says, hey, these words are off limits. You can't say these ever. It's just not there. However, there are texts that talk about heavily about our tongue, the way we, the words that we say, the way we use it to make speech in the world. And the context of our speech matters. The same sentence used in different contexts can be sinful or not sinful. For example, if I said get out in one context, it could be a perfectly good and positively good statement to make. If the house was on fire and I yelled get out to my wife, that's a good thing. I am yelling at her to help her survive. I'm trying to save her life, waking her up to get out of the house. If I'm fighting with my wife over something stupid and I'm in the wrong, and clearly so, and I yell at her, get out, to get out of the house because I'm mad and sinfully mad, that's sinful. So the same sentence used in different contexts, in one instance, it is a good thing, positively good even, and the other context, it's bad. In the same way, there are words that are in one context, they're good, Their contexts are bad. There are words that context matters to the way you use words. The reason I say that is because God uses some very provocative, explicit language in the Old Testament. Actually, we did a whole entire Tuesday night on this a while back. Yeah, we did. I talked about explicit language in the prophets. So yeah, but that's the short answer is context matters. There's no list in the Bible. But don't be dumb and using a bunch of words that contextually are always going to be provocative unnecessarily, or are just going to rile people up or make them think ill of you because of the associations of the word. There's no reason to use it. There we go. Justin's got the link there. There's no reason to use those words. You can find other ways to express what you're trying to express. And there's enough biblical text about the purity of our speech and things like that it turns out that speaking requires more thought than we give it. And the Bible encourages us to think carefully and choose our words carefully. But it gives us freedom to choose all kinds of words to express things because it doesn't give us a list. So you got to use your brain here. But there's some common sense stuff. There's some words you shouldn't say because of the context and the meaning behind them. It's pretty simple, at least when it comes to some of those. May not have been the answer you wanted. It makes things a little harder, but there you go. What about words that change in context? Yeah. So like if I'm reading out of a King James Bible, guess what? It's going to use the word ass a lot. And it means a donkey, but it uses it a lot. And so contextually, if I'm just reading the King James Bible to you and I say that word a lot, this is just because it's there. So yep, and now I'm banned. But if I call someone that, clearly the context is different, and I shouldn't say that. But that doesn't matter which word I'm using there. If I am sinning against someone in my speech, it doesn't matter which word I use. I'm still sinning against them. So there you go. There's a series of Christian cuss words that we replace other words with, but if we use them with the same sinful intentions in our heart, they're just as sinful as the other words. They're just culturally acceptable.
Okay. Well, hasn't really been any other questions in the chat, so I think we can officially be done.